everyone. I am Tamer Abu Ramadan. I'm the head of growth and insights at Neon. Neon is a product agency and product development agency, and we help our partners kind of bring their ideas to life digitally using digital products. And I am the head of growth and insights, and I'm responsible for the development of data-driven products at Neon. Now, for this project, we partnered up with Environics to leverage mobility data for an industry that's not really known for it, and it's especially this particular cut of it, which is retail cannabis in particular. This is an industry obviously that's fairly new and that's not very reliant on cannabis and on data. So before I dive into the project details, I'm gonna walk you through a little bit of why this was necessary and some of the business challenges, and in particular the challenges for Jima, which is our partner and client. So Jima is a new entrant into the retail cannabis space. It's a company that's about a year and a bit old, and they are the origin story of Jima is that it was started because of the lack and the need as well in the industry for more data and tech-centric approaches to selling cannabis in the retail space. And you'll see why that's kind of important, because the cannabis industry is very still wedded to the legacy market and the assumptions of the legacy market, and they're not necessarily being very responsive to the needs of the end consumer. And obviously, cannabis is extremely heavily regulated and restricted. And that's not just on the marketing and advertising side, but also on the retail side. So if you're a cannabis retailer, for example, in British Columbia, you're only allowed to have 8 stores. So if you're entering the market for the first time and you're looking to put in your store somewhere in an area that maximizes footfall traffic, you have to be very strategic about where you place your stores. Obviously, in addition to that, there are heavy restrictions on marketing and advertising. So that's something that prevents you from being able to say too much about yourself as a cannabis retailer. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a legacy market to a certain extent, and they carry some of those legacy assumptions that are less based on data and more based on assumptions and hunches and gut feeling. So one of those hunches and assumptions is, and you would have seen this in a lot of cannabis retailers, is there's this huge focus on branding and marketing. And while branding is important, and if you look at the consumer preference, it's not really what's top of mind for them. So if you look at the factors that most cannabis consumers care about when it comes to their cannabis, what they care about is price, quality, convenience, location. And location and convenience is the one thing that retailers really have a lot of control over, because price and quality is not something that's under the control of a cannabis retailer, because they are only able to buy what is made available by the licensed producers and the regulators. So if you're operating, for example, in Ontario, the selection of products that you can carry is simply what you can purchase off the wholesaler OCS, Ontario Cannabis Stores. So you can't get net new products that are not, available by your other competitors, for example. So that's not much of a differentiator. And price, there is a kind of floor on how much you could charge. You can't go below that floor. And so therefore you can't discount beyond it. So that leaves location and convenience as the one factor that's under the control of the cannabis retailers. So that would be most in line with what consumers actually want, but this is a space, as I alluded to, that's not really focused that much on, data necessarily. So they're not leveraging data to be able to place their locations in areas that are going to be the most effective and that are going to meet the consumer where they're at. Now, that's all well and good, but the problem is that the pandemic has impacted people's mobility behaviors. So in addition to, it's a twofold problem, is that we don't have really good data on mobility. The cannabis retailers are not reliant on it. And even if there were, mobility behaviors have shifted because of the pandemic. So this has had a huge impact on any kind of retail store, but in particular for cannabis. And because a lot of the areas that formerly would be very popular, for example, downtown cores, were less so as a result of the pandemic, and they're less heavily trafficked. So the ability to place your stores in areas that are going to be most effective has to take that into account. And then, as I'm sure everyone has noticed, there's an oversaturation of cannabis stores in the Canadian market. And this is more acute in, for example, places like Ontario, where it's hard to walk for more than 50 or 100 feet if you're in the downtown core without coming across a cannabis store. So because of that, you have to be very, very careful about where you place your stores so that you're not over competing with nearby stores, and to take into account that saturation. So that makes the problem of placing your retail stores even more drastic for cannabis retailers. And then finally, this is a relatively new industry. And that's important here because a lot of the rules of thumbs that develop over time for other types of retailers, for example, supermarkets, grocery stores, et cetera, haven't yet been developed. So there is no rule book on where to place stores and what rules to follow that will help you find a store that's going to, or find a location that's going to be effective. So that toolkit had to be invented for the cannabis space. And that's where Environics enters the picture, because given all these challenges, we needed good quality data on mobility behaviors to really understand where consumers are at and where to place stores. So the solution was to use digital mobility behaviors to inform the building of a site screening model that takes into account the digital mobility behaviors of known cannabis consumers and feed those into an algorithm that spits out essentially what is the propensity of a location to be a good candidate for a retail store. And then combine that with customer segmentation to inform not just our retail locations, but also our marketing and our messaging as well. And then iterate on this approach and expand it over time to other areas and other locations, because Jima started out in the BC market. So mobility behaviors. So this is a kind of an example of a visualization of an example of what would be happening with digital mobility behaviors. Obviously, we're talking about way more data points here. And there were millions of devices that Environics was able to produce to understand where consumers are at and how they're moving about. Obviously, this is all anonymized, but you can see that this is a big data approach to solving the problem of where to place retail store locations. So what Environics helped us do is the following: is look at existing retail locations, the examples you've seen on the left-hand side, which are green, and then look at the individuals who are consumers of cannabis who kind of go to these kind of stores, and then map backwards from that to understand their movements. So say, for example, you're someone that goes into one of these stores, you go in, you buy a product. We'd want to be able to take that individual, this anonymized individual, and others like them, and understand where they live, where they work, how they move about, where do they spend most of the times, based on their mobile devices. So the mobile devices are going to ping the tower to keep track of where their location is, use that information to understand how people move about, and therefore that'll help you understand which locations are going to probably be more heavily trafficked or over-index for footfall traffic of those cannabis consumers. So you're starting out with a big pool up here of devices, and then you're winnowing it down to based on existing cannabis stores to likely cannabis users, and then finally looking at those individuals and then looking at not just their behaviors, but also their segmentation data. And an example of, again, this is not a real example, this is just a visualization, obviously, but on the right-hand side, you have an example of someone and how they move about and the area. The reason why that's important is that we also wanted to take into account the trade area, as in how far someone would travel to a store, because as I mentioned, location is very important and convenience is very important for consumers. So you want something that's going to be close to you, right? You don't want to travel very, very far to get to your cannabis, because you don't care about the brand of the retailer. You just care about the products that are being carried by the retailer. So you want to take into account the distance that someone would travel to get their cannabis. So therefore, it's not just about, just points on a map. It's also about where do these people live. So once you've got that kind of raw data, and as Environics did, they then decided to obviously build an index. So what this index is you've got your map of Vancouver, for example, as what I was showing you before, and you want to figure out, okay, where should you place your stores? Which areas are going to be more likely to have a successful store? In order to do that, Environics built an index for every single point on the map, and that index takes into account its multiple variables, including mobility, but also business activity. So, for example, the number of cannabis purchasers. This is something that's obviously new, it's different, but these are not just your regular segments, these are in particular cannabis purchasers. And others that could include competitors. So we obviously don't want areas that have a lot of competitors around, and given the saturation in this market. So that goes into the factor, as well as the demographic variables, which kind of we all know, and psychographic variable. So we also took into account the social acceptability of cannabis in an area, because that's an important predictive variable as to whether a store would succeed or not. So once you've taken all these different variables, you can combine them into basically an index for every single location on a map. And this is kind of what it looks like. And this is an example, obviously, for Edmonton St. Albert in Alberta. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side is a heat map of every single FSA in that area, and green and red based on how high the index value is. The higher the value, the more green the area, the lower the value, the more red. And then mapped against that is the existing stores, and then the competitor stores, and then where we're looking to place stores. So you can see how what this allows us to do is to say, all right, here's our candidate store locations. Let's take a look at our heat map and see which one of those candidate store locations is more likely to have a lot of footfall traffic, a lot of business activity, not a lot of competitors around, and are going to attract the right consumer. And just off the top of your head when you look at it, is that this is quite important, because it's not just about footfall traffic and maximizing that. It's about maximizing footfall traffic and digital, and by relying on digital mobility behaviors for your cannabis consumer. And it produces obviously some counterintuitive insights, or not the things you would expect. Obviously, we would expect a lot of activity in downtown cores. But the reason why this is important is because it allows us to open that up and look at what are the underserved areas. And there were a lot of underserved areas in both Vancouver and Edmonton that we were able to uncover because of this digital mobility way of assessing where a retail store should be. And then obviously this was expanded out for other, I'm showing you just an example for Edmonton, but there's a lot more detail for all the other locations of interest in British Columbia and Alberta. So with the index in hand and the heat mapping of the locations of interest and the site screening model built out, it's now time to move to the next step, which is, who are these individuals that we talked about who are cannabis purchasers? So this is all still built upon the digital mobility behaviors of these cannabis purchasers, and mapping them back to their, obviously, the standard PRISM segmentations that Environics does. And that allows us to kind of marry the PRISM segments with the digital mobility behavior data to understand who are these individuals who are more likely to be cannabis purchasers and our end customer, both in British Columbia and Alberta. So this is a new way of tapping into the PRISM segments, and especially for a brand new company like Jima that doesn't have existing customers. We don't know who our customer is yet. We haven't opened up a retail store at that time, but we still needed to know, how do we package up our products, and how do we talk about them? What kind of products to carry? What is the price sensitivity of our customers? And is it important to compete on price or not? These are all the factors that needed to go into our thinking when we open up the stores, but we did not have any existing customer data. And this is why building on top of the digital mobility behaviors to find these prism segments was vital. So, outcomes. And obviously, we were able to open up these stores that we talked about based on the site screening model as one of the factors that went into selecting stores. And the stores openings were extremely successful. We are already at 10 plus stores now. And you'll notice that I said 10 plus instead of 8. The reason why the eight that are allowed in BC. And the reason why is because we were able to leverage this to expand beyond British Columbia and to open up in Ontario, in Alberta, in other provinces with larger national expansion plans to build on top of this. Now that we've got this working model and this working solution, and we can apply it across the board in all of Canada. And most importantly, though, the one thing that was accomplished here is infusing data and data-based thinking and data-driven thinking in both a vertical retail and in particular cannabis retail that are not known for their data-driven thinking. And this is an industry that's a legacy industry that's, like I said, reliant on gut instinct, not data, not insights. And this kind of data-driven approach is putting a lot of these assumptions into question and allowing us to find underserved and untapped opportunities in the cannabis space. And it's also functioning as a differentiator for us in the market because there's not a lot of players in the cannabis retail space that think like this and that have this data-driven strategic approach. And this is playing into our national expansion plans and going beyond just looking at locations, but we're kind of building on top of that to infuse data into retail store operations and obviously marketing, etc. So obviously we're very happy about the results and we've loved this partnership with Environics to do very cutting edge work that's kind of brand new and hasn't really been tried before. So that's it for me. And now I'll take questions from the audience and we'll move on to the Q&A section.